Alright, welcome to another episode, everyone. Today we'll be looking at trouble code P0155. That's specifically for an oxygen sensor on bank 2 sensor 1. Bank 2 just means it's the left side of the motor. Sensor 1 means it's before the catalytic converter. So what I'll do on this vehicle specifically, I'll show where bank 1 and bank 2 is. And sensor 1, again, just means that it's before the catalytic converter. Really, it's pretty easy. If you are receiving this code, it's pretty easy to diagnose. Really, it can only be two things. Number one, power is not getting from your vehicle to the sensor. So in other words, the harness that plugs into the oxygen sensor is not getting the supplied power. So we'll test that. Number two, if you are getting power, then the oxygen sensor is no longer good and we'll need to replace it. So if you are receiving this code, it's not really hard to diagnose. So that being said, let's go ahead. Now when you look up the code, P0155 is a problem with the oxygen sensor, bank 2 sensor 1. Now what does that mean? Bank 2 means it's the left side of the engine. Sensor 1 means it's before the catalytic converter. So again, bank 2 is the left side. Sensor 1 is before the catalytic converter. That's all that means. So in this vehicle, bank 2 happens to be right here. An easy way that I remember this is because I know cylinders 2, 4, and 6 are right here. And since 2 is an even number, that's just simply how I remember it. So since this is bank 2, bank 1 is on this side toward the firewall. You have cylinders 1, 3, and 5. So if you ever receive a trouble code for an oxygen sensor for bank 1, that's the right side of the motor, in this case toward the firewall. Bank 2 is the left side of the motor toward the radiator. So now we know exactly the area that we're looking at. And really, in this case, it's a pretty easy diagnosis, really. It can only be two things. And in fact, this is where the oxygen sensor lives. Number one is to see if power is getting to the sensor. If we are getting power to the sensor, then we'll test the sensor itself. It's one or the other. So if you're getting this trouble code, it's going to be one, either power is not getting to the sensor, or two, the sensor is shot. So we'll test both things, and you'll be able to diagnose your vehicle and get it back up and running. Alright, so our connection is right here. So the first step is we want to make sure that power is indeed getting to this harness. So just unplug it from the oxygen sensor. And what we'll need in this case is a multimeter, which we have right here. Let me just zoom out. And if you've never used one of these, they're essentially very easy to use. You have a bunch of different functions, but in this case, we just want to use the volts setting. So we'll just place that here. And as you do this, just make sure that your ignition key is off. Now, coming from the multimeter, you have two leads. You have a positive and, of course, a negative. Now, the black wire, that's your negative. The black wire goes to ground. You can even put this to the negative terminal on the battery. Some people say you shouldn't do that, but I have to admit, sometimes I just place it on the negative terminal on the battery because I know I'm always getting a good connection. But again, if you also want to use ground, that's any metal point, the frame of the vehicle, for example, you can also place it there. So, in this case, I'll place my lead to the negative terminal on the battery here. And now what I'm going to do is turn on the ignition key. I won't crank the car, just turn the key to the on position. Okay, to the on position here. Don't crank it again, just turn it on. And then what we're going to do is take the positive lead coming from the multimeter, and let me just make sure you guys can see this. And if you take a look at the harness here, you have three connections. 1, 2, 3. In this case, we'll just be touching the third terminal here, and we should see battery voltage, which we do. We're getting 12 volts worth of power through this harness. Now, if you don't receive a voltage reading, again, make sure that you have good ground or that your negative terminal here, that the negative lead is going to the battery, just to make sure. If you're still not getting a connection, sometimes check the wires back here and back of the harness. Sometimes they may fray, maybe they've melted, maybe an insect has been one of the wires off. I've seen crazy things throughout the years, so just make sure that these wires are in good shape. If they are, check your fuses as well. In this case, this runs through a 15 amp fuse. If that looks okay, the last resort is you may have a problem with the ECM. But chances are, if you're not receiving a reading here, it's usually because one of these wires have a short in it, and you just need to repair it, and you'll have a good connection again. Now once you verify that we have power getting to the harness, we'll go ahead and check if the oxygen sensor itself is in good shape. And to do that, we'll do an ohms reading, which is again a setting here on the multimeter. Very simple, but we'll be able to see if this sensor is in good shape. Now for this next test, we'll be checking the sensor itself. Now to do that, place your multimeter into the ohms setting. And what the manual states is at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which should have an ohms reading between 2.3 and 4.3 ohms. Let's take a look. Now let me just give you a close-up here. Now again, this is the harness that goes directly to the oxygen sensor, and of course we're still unplugged, okay? So this, before we tested power essentially from the vehicle to the sensor, now we're done with this. Now we're testing the sensor itself, which is this guy. So what you're going to do is take your two leads from the multimeter, and you have three terminals here. This is terminal 1, terminal 2, terminal 3. In this case, we're going to touch terminal 3 and 1, and we should have an ohms reading. We should be again around, we should be on the high end just because of the temperature in here, but my guess is between 4 to 4.5 ohms, around there. But let's just take a look what we come up with here. And as you can see, we're at 4.4 ohms. So this sensor is perfectly fine. It's in good shape. Now usually if the sensor is no longer in working condition, your ohms reading will be completely off. It won't make any sense whatsoever. So this just verifies that the sensor is in good shape. However, there is one more test you can do. And let me just zoom in here. This is for a continuity test. Oh, you know, before I do that, let me just show you. On a multimeter, you have a continuity setting. That's this guy right here, okay? So if we just place the multimeter to the continuity setting, we should hear an audible alarm, which we do. Essentially, all that continuity means is that 2 points make a connection, okay? So clearly we have a connection. Now, this is really good for really any kind of electrical repair. Let me just clean up these wires so you guys can clearly see this. And zoom back down here. One last test you can do is check to see if you have continuity between terminals 1 and 2 and terminals 2 and 3. Now, if the sensor is good, you should not have continuity. Okay, so in other words, you should not hear an audible alarm. So if I touch terminals 1 and 2, I don't hear anything. If the sensor was bad, I would be hearing an alarm right now. Also test terminals 2 and 3. So 2 and 3. As you can tell, I don't hear anything. So this just verifies that this sensor is in good shape. So if you are receiving a code 155, if you're receiving a code P0155, you should hear either an audible alarm when you do this test, something like this, or your ohms reading will be off, or again, you have a problem of power getting from this harness to the sensor. Now, if you have verified that you do have a problem with the sensor, let me get underneath the car. I'll show you where the sensor is located. You can go ahead and remove it, and you'll be back in good shape. So now we're looking up from underneath the vehicle, and right here is where the O2 harness is, the connection. And if we follow the wire all the way down, let me just see if I can give you guys a good shot here. We take a look right there. Now this is where the sensor lies, right here, and as you can see, the sensor screws into the exhaust manifold. Now for this vehicle, really the best thing to use is an oxygen sensor removal tool. When you purchase the sensor, ask the auto parts supplier where you're purchasing it from if you can rent a oxygen sensor socket removal tool. And this will make the job a lot easier. Without the tool, in this case, it's going to be pretty difficult just because of where it is. Now, on other vehicles, you can simply remove this using a wrench, but on this vehicle, you really want to get that socket tool. So once you obtain the tool, you just slip it over the end, unscrew this old oxygen sensor, install the new one, and you'll be in good shape.